Alan McIntyre and Ryan Gerbrandt. Thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, of course. So before we get too far down the road here, why don't you both take a minute to walk us through your backgrounds and your current roles before we dive headfirst into this conversation about communications networks and private LTE and why this all matters for utilities and the energy transition. Ryan, do you want to get us started?
I'd be happy to. And again, thank you for the opportunity, John, to join you here. This is an exciting conversation, as you said, kind of coming off of the heels of another fantastic annual UBA event, just an ongoing conversation that it's great to share. It's one of the things I love the most about this industry, kind of the ability to share collaboratively and best practices, super non-competitive, to be able to get this information out there. So my journey, John, starts over 20 years ago. My entire career has been in the utility industry. I actually started with a Canadian utility called Manitoba Hydro, right out of school as a telecom and controls engineer. But really saw the opportunity to take that experience, out, into the private sector, starting to work with some innovative technology companies. Obviously, at that point in time, it was really at the advent of kind of what we look back on now as smart metering, is where I got my first start. You spent about 13, 14 years with a company called Trilliant Networks, who was at the beginning of that cycle, developing the new innovations, different types of networking technologies. But really, it just educated me, frankly, in my opinion, to be ready for this opportunity to capture now what we can do with this explosive growth in the new tool with private LTE. And, that brought me to Anterix. And I've been here now for, coming on 4 years as the chief operating officer. And, we're really, taking advantage of our core strengths and our history and capabilities, founded by the founders of Nextel Wireless, identified an opportunity and really understand the use of critical networks and the role they play in critical infrastructure, and have brought private spectrum to the market to be able to start building the foundation that modern networks are built upon. And obviously Alan and the team at Southern are our crystal ball, as they are, I think, for everybody in the industry, really showing us what the art of the possible is and starting to build that momentum and credibility for, what a true utility operator can look like, with a modern piece of wireless infrastructure. So just, again, excited to be here, share my experience, just kind of what we're seeing across the industry, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, and Ryan, I think it would be helpful here, even before we move on to Alan, to explain a little bit more of Anterix's role in the market and, private network spectrum, all of that. So just at a high level, can you explain, where you guys fall? And that should serve as a nice foundation for this conversation.
Absolutely. No, I'd be happy to. It's not, a lot of people probably don't appreciate, there's these wireless airwaves out there, that I draw an analogy to real estate. Just like when you're building a residential building or a commercial building, you pay a lot of attention to the property that you're building it on. That's where your true foundations are, and the type of building you build, where you build your building, what it's ultimately used for, is all rooted in that foundational decision that you use. And wireless spectrum, in modern networks is that foundation. Without having secure, reliable, licensed spectrum access, you have a hard time building any kind of modern wireless network, that is built atop those foundations. And what we did is we went and actively pursued, to bring to market a swath of what's considered broadband spectrum, so that we could begin this modernization discussion broadly with the nation's utilities. And that was a many-year endeavor with the FCC, who regulates access to this spectrum asset. And, we identified an opportunity where there was being underutilized spectrum, in the FCC inventory and being used for legacy narrowband networks, and pursued that activity to be able to identify this opportunity. And now, working with the utilities across the nation to take advantage of this unlocking capability the spectrum really brought to the market, that now created, kind of all these other opportunities in terms of being able to apply really what are nationally, kind of standardized networking technologies, but are dependent on having this core underlying foundation to be able to build those on. And so we're working with organizations. We were one of the co-founders, actually, of UBA, John, when it originally started, kind of recognizing the benefits of being able to really drive and evangelize the conversation around all of our combined experiences. Again, I'll say it again, kind of Alan and the team at Southern Linc, have always been, kind of that leader to me. That thing I think that we all aspire to, as utilities, to be able to build these kind of networks. But having them as the trailblazers has been just fantastic to be able to help drive and educate. And I'm sure Alan will share, but we all kind of get mutual benefits of that over time, right? As as that knowledge pool expands. But that's at the heart of what we do, John. Our business is really about bringing that spectrum to market. But hopefully I'll share more about all the other stuff that we do, because we really don't stop there. We've taken on a much bigger role of building the ecosystem, bringing utilities together, formed the utility advisory board to help drive innovation and advancements in this area. But it's rooted on that core aspect of spectrum, which is what drives our business.
But just to tie a bow on that spectrum piece, so that's a regulated finite capacity that Anterix goes out and makes a sizable investment to bring that capacity to market, and then leases access to a certain amount of the capacity to utilities, region by region, right?
That's exactly right. No, it's a very scarce asset. You hit a very important point of it. It's finite in every sense of the word. There's only so much of it out there. There's nothing we can do to make more. It's just the laws of physics. And you're right. We have a nationwide position, in our 900 megahertz spectrum, that we work directly with utilities to make sure they have access to it, so that they can build these modern networks on top.
That was great. Okay, Alan, you've already been gassed up a little bit here by Ryan, so I think that's a perfect way to lead into your background and what Southern Company did with Southern Linc and really being that trailblazer in the market. So why don't you share a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I started out with Southern Linc in 1995, and so I was one of the first probably 30 or so employees at Southern Linc. We used to have little laminated cards you put in your wallet with all the employees. So, it tells you it was a long time ago and not very many folks. And so beauty of that is starting on the ground floor as we were building out at the time a Motorola IDE network was you got to work in a lot of different areas. Ultimately, I was really responsible for a lot of the RF engineering for the IDE network, but got to really do just about anything that needed to be done because there's so few of us. But we grew that IDE network. Obviously, Nextel was in the market at the time, and that technology really was very successful from a push to talk standpoint. And once we added packet data to it in the early 2000s, we actually started using it for SCADA on the distribution side. So it really was a core network, both from a voice and a data standpoint within Southern Company. Around the 2010 timeframe, we were looking out to really 2020 to see what we needed to do. We knew data demands were growing. We were seeing it on the SCADA side. We didn't think IDE would make it that far, quite honestly. And so we really, evaluated different technologies. We looked at, using commercial providers, building an LMR network, a P25, for push to talk, and just using commercial cellular for data needs. And we evaluated several different options and ultimately decided LTE was the right fit for us, given the data demands. And so, we were estimating in 2010 how many data devices we thought we'd have in 2020. Probably.
How wrong were you?
That's what I was going to say. It's probably there's probably a good story and a bad story here. We were pretty far off, but we were we were conservative, obviously being a utility, and so it was about 3x. We had 3x more than what we estimated by the time we really reached 2020. So and that was really one of the benefits of having LTE. It really didn't matter, honestly. And so we've started building our network in 2015. Had SCADA units on it in 2016, and then we moved the voice users over in 2019. And so now the network's fully built out, been built out. Yeah, I always like to say too, we actually were under our budget, and so for a large capital project, that's always a good thing. So now we really have Southern Linc. I always say has the honor and privilege of operating and maintaining Southern Company's private LTE network, and it really is that. I mean, it's a joy to be able to do it. Especially for me, I always say, if you believe in destiny or divine intervention, I went into electrical engineering thinking, hey, I'll try to get a job with Alabama Power. I didn't really, honestly, the power side wasn't quite as appealing to me as electromagnetic theory and communications theory. And so I end up working at a communications company within Southern Company that's doing exactly that. So it's a pretty cool journey for me.
That is cool, and under budget, and you ended up finding more use cases down the line.
Absolutely.
So I would say that was a pretty successful endeavor if you hit both of those marks. And we'll get into more of Southern Linc and Southern Company system throughout this conversation, I'm sure. But just to set the stage a bit for this discussion about utilities and the state of private communications networks, a few weeks ago, I published a piece on POWERGRID International based on some of those really fascinating conversations, Ryan, that you alluded to that took place at the Utility Broadband Alliance event in Minneapolis. And one of my main takeaways was that communication networks, and more specifically private LTE, is viewed by so many of the largest utilities as this backbone of the energy transition, that in order to enable all of these devices and intelligently plan and optimize for the future, we needed to evolve in the tools that we had deployed in the field. So I'll first let each of you respond to that characterization if I'm seeing this in the right way. But some of your takeaways from being in the room there and that overall outlook.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear within a utility that connectivity especially is essential now. As I mentioned, the growth in devices, you got to have something to bring that data back. And especially when we start looking at the modern utility where we're talking two-way power flows, you've got to get into broadband, high throughput, low latency type communications. Just the narrowband technologies that we're all used to just aren't going to cut it. And so I think there is a realization between, within Southern, it's really an and strategy between wired and wireless. We have the LTE network. We're also deploying a lot of fiber. And so having both of those options out there is really kind of critical to be able to support the data demands that we're seeing.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, John. That's exactly where my head was going too, Alan, is, first off, my answer is absolutely, kind of communications are the foundation. But I think it is important to draw kind of that equivalency back to, as Alan said, we've been investing as an industry fiber, out to the substations for quite a while, right? And that was really driven by the transformation of the idea of a digital substation, right? Kind of bringing more, it is broadband data, kind of to the heart of a substation where, really the center of control, of the traditional grid, I'll call it, kind of really lived, the distribution and the transmission sub. But when I think about, I think the context of your question, John, is kind of when you think about the energy transition, right? What does that mean and kind of what's the context of it? It's a different looking grid. It's a lot more complicated. It's distributed, as Alan said. It's intermittent, when you start putting a lot of these renewable assets out there. And to me, that brings, kind of the communications requirement, like it did to the sub, out to what we call now, the grid edge, right? So moving away from the sub as you start bringing these systems out. And there's a reason for it, and that's because that's where the modern technology and these assets are going to live. They're going to live on the side of customer homes. They're going to be solar fields. There's going to be whatever other these assets are. And you need to have that same broadband, low latency, high security, kind of controlled communications as an extension out to all of these, far more distributed and remote assets. And it's that in combination in my mind when I think about telecommunications, not exclusively to the wireless side, but them as a portfolio is really what is absolutely this foundation to the backbone of, kind of what we need to be able to build the modern system that is the grid being built today.
And Ryan, maybe you can help define the scope of this topic a little bit for us, even using a bit of a history lesson in the evolution of networks and the technology and how this has sequentially, I guess, through Alan's career from start to today, how it's evolved to meet that shifting dynamic.
Yeah, let me start with what I think is really kind of the punchline. To me, private is the game changer in all of this stuff. And I say that because private to me means control, right? And there's a lot of different aspects about where that comes in, but there's been a long technology evolution over time. But the whole idea in kind of utilities using private networks is not new. I mean, that we've been doing for decades, right? And there's been different types of technologies that have been built out over time. But the big difference then in terms of what we're doing with LTE versus some of the systems we had in the past we've been kind of incumbent as an industry to work a lot of the application business side around proprietary networking technologies, right? We have this history of a network to do a certain singular thing, right? And they work really, really good, and honestly, I'm guilty. I mean, that's where my background is. I came from smart metering, and we built specific networks to talk to smart meters, and that's what we needed to do because it was a very unique business challenge about how do you get connectivity out to literally the side of a consumer's home, every single consumer, across the utilities, distributed footprint. And so we worked with what we had and we built it. But some of that capability didn't really get unlocked, coming back to the spectrum story, until you had the spectrum that was being able to be used to build these kind of modern networks. Alan referenced IDEN, from the past. They had a similar kind of life cycle, as it was really being innovated, and Nextel at the time was bringing it to market with Motorola. But now, because of the spectrum availability, we can now talk about really what have been traditionally utilized for the global telecom operators, right? And I see this as a fantastic convergence of megasectors, as I call it. We're not inventing new technology. Really, for the first time, we're taking advantage of drafting behind the billions of dollars of R&D, that are going into this global technology stack. Today, we know it as 4G, already being developed into 5G, and gosh, they're already talking about 6G, coming out the other end of it. And I think utilities are going to step behind that curve a little bit. I see no reason why utility would be on the bleeding edge of that technology cycle. But it's nice to draft as an industry behind all of that momentum and take advantage of those capabilities. But let me give you one quick use case, John. That's probably the best way to think about this. We did some work with San Diego Gas and Electric, too, and one of their big applications is something called falling conductor protection that I love to talk about. It's a really understandable use case. Obviously, when it comes to utility use cases, in my mind, kind of wildfire mitigation is one of the most critical that I can imagine, right? Where truly life, limb, and even potential viability of the utility itself is, at risk in terms of not being able to perform. And, San Diego had looked at it proactively to identify what kind of solutions can they put out that actually proactively can stop a wildfire before it starts. And that's kind of the hallmark of this solution, where you can literally, through sensing, be able to detect, a broken line. So imagine a distribution line or a transmission line that for whatever reason, in a storm or a wind event or, other areas could be ice or snow and that kind of stuff, physically breaks while it's energized. The physics says it'll take between 1.2 and 1.3 seconds before that line will touch the ground, where it can become an arcing source and start a wildfire. Obviously, that takes a pretty advanced system, both on data and intelligence and automation, to be able to detect, when that break happens, do the analysis to figure out where that break is, in proximity to the devices that you've got, and make a decision to disconnect it, and then actually disconnect it, to depower that line. And it also just happens, these areas tend to be pretty remote. And when you think about high wildfire risk areas in California, I'll use for an example, it's in the valleys, it's in the Central Valley. I mean, it's in these very difficult, challenging locations. And so being able to bring reliable, high-speed communications into those areas necessitated wireless. I mean, that was an obvious. And necessitated, coming back to these attributes of control, a system that you could deploy where you need it, when you need it, and being able to control things like priority, and things like the speed and latency. And you can only do that, frankly, on a private network. You just can't have that kind of control on the alternatives, when you're looking at public systems. And one of our engineers, we did a study with Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, who's one of the technology providers behind that solution, said it's not that it can't be done, on other networks, considering public, but it's the difference between it working 6 out of 10 times versus working 10 out of 10 times. And that becomes the logic that you think about of the benefits, not just putting it where you need it, but the performance and the reliability that you're expecting from something as critical as being able to stop a wildfire.
And Ryan, you've talked about that control piece several times now and the importance there. And I was going to ask Alan about, walking us through the business case that Southern made for this kind of sizable investment. And maybe in answering that, you can also address the value of private versus utilizing public infrastructure that's already out there. Why doesn't it work for what you need today?
Yeah, and I'll be happy to kind of, there's and Ryan kind of touched on some of it. There's really 3 pillars, if you will, that we built our business case around it, and they hold today. They're still very valid. It's reliability, resiliency, and security, and each of those have different aspects. And so, from a reliability standpoint, it's about redundancies and how to avoid outages. And so, just to give you an example, for our cell sites, we have either a generator or fuel cell with enough fuel to power the site for at least a week at just about every cell site. The commercial carriers don't do that. And I mean, there's reasons why they don't. I mean, it's more of a consumer oriented service. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense. We have redundant transport to large majority of our sites. Again, it doesn't make sense for the commercial carriers to do that sort of investment. And then, what we've done with our core network, and we've got 2 different cores, fully geo-redundant. I really describe it as it's kind of like Noah's Ark, and then we've got a second Noah's Ark. And so we got 2 by 2 in one data center and 2 by 2 in the other. So we have local redundancy and geo-redundancy. And so, it's all those things to avoid that bad day experience. It comes into play all the time. We're in the Southeast. We have hurricanes, we have tornadoes, all kinds of different severe weather situations. And so, being able to avoid those, and I jokingly say, we want to be the old Maytag repairman commercial, where our field guys are just sitting there, hurricane rolls through, they got their feet up on the desk, it's like no big deal. It doesn't always work that way. But I'll give you an example. Hurricane Zeta really cut through our service territory from southwest to northeast, went all the way through from Mississippi Power, Alabama Power, Georgia Power, affected all 3. It was a large outage event from a power standpoint, and we had over 300 cell sites on some form of either a fuel cell or a generator. If you didn't have that backup power there, you'd be in trouble. You'd have cell site outages. And so, that's critically important. That was a key differentiator. The resiliency piece, we view that as, all right, that bad event happens. How quick are you able to restore service after that event? And so we have a whole fleet of mobile assets. We, affectionately term it our barnyard animals. We have cows and goats and sows and we're getting drones now and, blimps and all kinds of things, balloons. So it's really a pretty robust fleet, because we are the power company. We know that, power is going to be out, things are going to happen. You got to be able to respond. And so we're proud of the response we've been able to do as a company over the years. And that just, provides confidence back into Southern Company that, we've got it and we're going to keep them running in those worst of times. And then security is obviously something on its own. I'm sure we'll talk about it in more detail, but it's hyper critical in today's times.
A hallmark of the utility industry is that few want to be a first mover. Few want to try things out for the rest. And there are many that would rather wait and watch a Southern company make a sizable investment in private LTE to see will this work for us? We'll let them take that flack from their regulators or their board or whatever. How challenging was that in the quote unquote early days, given that you didn't have, that book of case studies that we now know have helped more and more of the largest, IOUs make this decision?
Yeah, it's certainly challenging. Luckily we had been, and we do have a commercial business as well. And so, we've got a foot kind of in the small carrier space. And so, we had been operating an IDE network for, 20 plus years. And so we had that experience. And so that helped. But yeah, certainly there's skepticism of, do we need to do, an LTE network? Will we be chasing technology? Because you hear about 5G, Ryan said it, now you hear about 6G, right? And so
I drove past a sign for Xfinity in Atlanta the other day that said 10G all over it. And I was thinking, what am I reading right now? Either I just don't know enough about this stuff or we're making it up at this point.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. And so, and you're in a utility where this is not part of really the core business, right? We've got, and Ryan touched on this. We've got all sorts of things going on in the electric industry space right now, between net zero goals and somewhat in our footprint unprecedented load growth. And so, how do you address all that? We just built the first new nuclear, in the country in 30 years. And so that was a pretty big investment. So, how do we, get the investment when you got all those other things going on to do private LTE? And part of it was, it goes back to spectrum, just quick, history lesson on Link and spectrum and why we were unique. By virtue of having Link as a commercial business, we really had a need for additional spectrum when we launched, and we were 800 megahertz with the IDEN technology. And so we went to FCC sponsored auctions, and we participated in 3 800 megahertz auctions and won geographic licenses. And that became really kind of key and critical, because then, Nextel filed a white paper to basically reban the 800 megahertz spectrum. And so throughout that process, and that was basically a 3-year process, we ended up with contiguous spectrum in the 800 megahertz band. And so, it's like I always say, it's not a lot, but it was enough. And so we were in a position where we had contiguous spectrum and could deploy an LTE network. No other utility up to that point really had that option. And so, what Anterix is bringing now is that option. And so that made us unique. And so, I got the question all the time, what are other utilities doing? And, unfortunately, I had to walk through that spectrum explanation and say, well, they don't really have an option right now. And so fortunately now there is an option. And so I think, that's where we're seeing other utilities kind of follow suit. We always joke that utilities want to be a fast second. Nobody does want to be first, but we were in a unique position. And so that really helped. And with the data demands and the growth that we were seeing, LTE was kind of the natural fit. And so we were able to get approval to push on and start building the network.
I'm going to keep that fast second one. That's going to be useful for me, because I live in the South as well, Alan, but I'm not as Southern as you. So I think that I might even get a few more quips that'll make me, get some geographic credibility.
You might before too. That's right.
Yeah, my drawl might come out. It's still a work in progress, but it comes out from time to time. So Ryan, as Anterix is then working with utilities that are embarking down this road and questioning, how do I make this case to my board and to regulators and so on? How do they quantify the value, given Alan's previous note that, we were thankfully under budget, but there were 3 times as many devices that we ultimately would be able to use this network for. That seems like a pretty sizable spread, though, when you think about, pitching this to the powers that be, saying we need to do this, when there is a certain degree of there's a degree of uncertainty in what the grid is going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years as we continue down this road of the energy transition. How do you work through that with them?
Yeah, there's a couple interesting things that have happened. I think it's worth noting, kind of now since Alan and team kind of were the first movers, the ones comfortable taking that risk.
You can say thank you.
100% thank you. But you think about where we're at today, and I'll just use UBBA as a lens, John, kind of you saw it, there was, about 35 utilities there. My math, I think it was like 20 last year, maybe 10 before. And Alan, I don't know how many were with you guys back in 2019, but certainly it was some number smaller than that, right? But I just use that as a lens, to kind of give, kind of an optic of where the general sentiment is, that we're seeing out there in terms of the utility conversation. And it's important, John, for that very reason, about kind of why utilities want to be that second mover, right? It's about risk. It's about not wanting to be at the front end, and really looking to draft in behind, folks like Southern, to be able to take advantage and not be that front runner. We're not in that place today, right? When I think about it, my math says, I think we're in deployment right now in 18 states, something like that across the U.S. That's a lot when you think about it from, where Al and the team started having to defend why they were the only ones, kind of going down this path to today. But that plays heavily, into the psychology of adoption, right? They see this activity, they can learn from their peers, they can ask the questions about experience and stuff like that they couldn't have done. Alan had nobody to ask, right? You had telecom operators and the Nextel folks and stuff like that, but really it was different. You had to correlate it back to, the language that utility operators would understand, about what they were trying to do. But so we've come so far beyond that. But honestly, in that backdrop, John, my experience right now is kind of the broad foundational part that we kind of started this conversation on, is an aspect that LTE almost sells itself in that context, right? If you're a utility operator and you're embracing what Alan just said about this, I think of it as like volume of change and pace of change. When I think about what's happening in the macro industry today, I've not seen anything like it. Like I said, and I've been in this industry for, 20, 25 years now. And that I think you'll hear from any utility operator, right? In their own way about what priorities and stuff that they face. But you can correlate really directly to the way I prepare myself in my utility today has to have a digital component to it, right? If I'm not conscientiously and proactively thinking about this digital foundation, is another way to think about this, that makes that change possible for the clean energy transition, to get prepared for security, to be prepared for the environmental storms and stuff that comes through, you're missing kind of a core component of what your utility solution portfolio needs to look at. So you've got this kind of operator backdrop, John, that starts creating the imperative. The conversation actually was up a little bit. If you're not doing this at this point in time, you better start getting prepared to answer why, right? And that's very different than a few years ago when you were explaining and justifying why you are doing it. And I think that was, I think it was LCRA that made that comment or something on one of the panels and I thought that was fantastic. I think it's so true, that the proof is out there. I mean, the use cases are out there. The data is out there about, Alan's network and the reliability and the resiliency that it has compared to the alternatives, right? And if you're honestly preparing, judiciously to be ready for this new future of clean energy, the environmental storms, the hurricanes, the wildfires, or whatever it is, at some point, I believe, kind of what LCRA said, you do need to be prepared to answer the question, why am I not doing this, right? And, kind of what else am I doing if I'm not being prepared for this? So then obviously there's business stuff underneath that, John, clearly. I mean, these are business case driven programs like any capital program in a utility. Absolutely needs to be prudent, absolutely needs to be rationalized through. And it's proven to be so, right? It economically makes sense, from an operational performance, it makes sense. One of the reasons we're seeing some utilities drive it is frankly an optimization to bring more capital in. That's really a matter of understanding the utility business model, where they've operated for, the last decade or so really on public network alternatives where it's all operating expense, which is not consistent with the goal of the utility business model. And so there's many, many things that start playing into it, but it's 100% rooted on need and utility operations in the business.
I mean, it's kind of been neat to see the evolution, I think, from where we started and the questions, what are other people doing? And no real answer to that. Then, others started doing pilots and it was a question then of, will LTE support our use cases? And and I think we've evolved past that to show yes it will. And so now it's really those questions Ryan brought up, and so it's really it's really been a neat development curve watching as the adoption's been happening.
Yeah, and people at the ABBA conference at Coffee were calling you the Godfather. So that's a new nickname that's floating around. No one said that, but I could get it going in Kansas City next year. I'll try my best. Something that fascinates me about this topic specifically is the versatility of private LTE. And you were mentioning all the different things that you can do with that network when previously we were, piecing out responsibilities to individual networks. The priority stack for each utility, even underneath those pillars that you laid out, Alan, is likely to be very different. Your needs in a vertically integrated market like the Southeast, extreme weather, so on and so forth, are far different than that of San Diego Gas and
Absolutely.
Electric, with a lot of distributed assets and electric vehicles coming onto the grid. And it's fascinating to me that each one, there's this broad value, but they're each very specific regionally and I think Excel was mentioning it about too, that they're dealing with at times 5,000 to 8,000 megawatt power generation swings, and the intermittency of the renewables on the grid, and it's only going to, penetrate further, is something that you have to be able to communicate with in near real time, just due to the impacts to the system. So that's more of a comment than a question, but I invite either of you to weigh in on that piece of just the versatility of the asset, the tool, and how it differs utility to utility.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. Utilities have not. This isn't new. Southern Company celebrated 100 years of telecommunications last year. I mean, we had both Alabama Power and Georgia Power had AM radio stations, like in the 1922, I think, that they would send out load demand instructions to generating plants and communicate with linemen in the field using AM radio. And so, utilities have had some sort of communication capability for a long time. Obviously, it went to these proprietary narrowband kind of single purpose networks. You think about, I'll use Southern. We had our IDE network for push to talk. A lot of utilities have some type of land mobile radio system. We had a SCADA network in Alabama Power, used IDE in Georgia and Mississippi. We have an AMI network that's separate. We had network lighting control networks. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? LTE can do all of that. And so, and more. And obviously we found a lot of use cases. We've got sensors, for EV charging stations to know, is there a car there? And we've got monitors or, for our linemen, they go to a company crew headquarters where there's a fuel pump, swipe a card, all that communications is through the LTE network, and, monitoring the fuel in the gas tank. And, anything you can do a sensor or get data back, we're trying to do with LTE. And so, the list of use cases is vast and wide. And so no matter what a utility really needs to do, I think LTE can fit that need. And that's really the beauty of it. And, Ryan mentioned it. It's a global standard-based technology. And so you don't have the vendor lock-in that you had with the proprietary systems. And probably the big thing to think about is the operational aspects. If you've got a multitude of other networks, you've got to have spare parts for those networks. You've got to have technicians that are trained to know how to maintain those networks. Now LTE, you've got really, get down to a single network. You can do a better job maintaining it because it can be more of a focus. So there's a lot of advantages to really, and you'll get the counter argument. We got all our eggs in one basket. Certainly have heard that one. But I would argue back. But you can weave a pretty darn good basket. When you're focused on one technology.
I'll add one thing, John, just to add on to that I see. This is kind of let's look to the future a little bit. The one thing that excites me about it is there's a virtuous cycle that comes as a result of this, right? And kind of this foundation and the common technology stack, the standards, the ecosystem. Just as you said, Alan, there's dozens and dozens of use cases, already out there today, and still pretty early innings, in terms of broad industry adoption. But that's for a reason. It can exist, because of the standards and the foundation and the ecosystem that we're all growing together. I referenced this point earlier. One thing we've been focused on is kind of helping to build that ecosystem. So I think we're like 120 members or something like that now in the Anterix Active Ecosystem program. And it's specifically to help drive innovation. How do we help stimulate bringing R&D dollars from innovative tech and solution companies, into the utility landscape, so that they can build the next generation of applications for Alan and the utilities, right? Not just what we're doing today, which is already very, very well represented and supported on LTE.
Yeah, don't let Alan do it himself. have Alan pay you to do it for him.
Alan and everybody will be a partner. They'll be a partner all along the way. I'll definitely say that.
Yeah,
but no, they shouldn't
do this business thing.
Shouldn't have to invent this stuff on their own, right? No utility should have to invent this stuff on their own. There's plenty of good entrepreneurs out there that would love to bring ideas and solutions to Alan and be able to commercialize them. but we can now do that in a way that I've never seen before, kind of on this type of foundation. And it's another angle that I talk with a lot of utilities about in terms of just, kind of digitalization strategies, right? And how to think about that, not just to solve kind of your critical needs today, but to set yourselves up, on an innovation foundation that you can take to market and you can do all kinds of cool stuff. And there's cool stuff out there. I mean, there's stuff going on with, AI, machine learning. Alan, you referenced drones and stuff like that. I think there's going to be a whole next generation of kind of data enablement that's coming on the heels of all this. We're still kind of living within application silos in my mind today. It's great that they can all use one network, but they're pretty isolated still, right? But I don't think it's going to always be that way. I think once you've got kind of this big broadband pipe and all the data that comes through it and the open standard side that comes as a result, of using this kind of technology, we're at the beginning of what that curve could look like in my mind.
Well, and that's why I build it at, communications networks as being the, key enabler of the energy transition, because you think about these simultaneous evolutions technologically that are taking place in the utility space with AMI 2.0 and DERMS and all of these different tools to help us know what is actually happening on the grid and where our assets are and how they're performing and how they connect together beyond just a map or a spreadsheet or whatever kind of rudimentary application we used previously to connect all of these things together. Without that underbelly of connection, it seems little advancement is possible. It's difficult to execute any of these things without that foundational piece.
Absolutely. I'll make another interesting point too. How many people do you think out there know that utilities are operating some of the largest telecom networks in the country? I bet you very few, honestly. And I think it speaks to it. It's a little bit in my mind of kind of a garage activity, at least it's perceived that way. I mean, this is the company that sells me electrons to turn my light switch back on. It's not a telecom, high-tech innovation company. And I think that's a persona that we got to keep trying to drive out there in the industry. We've heard it, Alan, you and I certainly have, as kind of the IT, OT convergence that's had all kinds of crazy names, in the utility space over time. But I don't think we're there yet, if you want my opinion. As, a technologist and IT communications guy that came from the utility, I don't think it's recognized even across a lot of utilities, John, that point that you just made, right, about how important that is to the core strategic assets of the company. A lot of utilities still look at their wires and their generators and stuff like that, right? I'm not trying to be negative, it's just a reality, and I think that's changing. I'm seeing a lot of momentum building around that, but that realization is not pervasive yet across the industry.
Well, I'm available as a freelance consultant to Anterix. Only kidding. So let's round this out. I think the integration piece is something we should probably address here. And Alan, I'm happy to hear your perspective on just what it was like to go from, okay, we've made this decision to make the investment. Now we're executing, and executing is almost just as difficult with most big things. And you heard that at the conference as well. Other utilities that are midway through their journey of working with engineers on so many different teams to put this thing in the field. How did that go for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. It's definitely a different animal. I mean, it's one thing to, get the approval and start building and, building cell sites and, putting in core networks. That's kind of the easy part in a way. I mean, it really is, how do you turn it up and operate it? And Ryan kind of mentioned, I mean, a lot of the things we've done, we had to really, you would think some of it would have already been done, but like we were one of the first, because we didn't have a fallback to 3G, to be doing VoLTE only and having 911 with VoLTE. So, I mean, kind of first in the country kind of stuff. And in mission critical push to talk with EMBMS to have large group calls. I mean, I think we were one of the first to really blaze that trail. So there were some, certainly some mountains to climb, and it was painful, I think, at times. But, I think, we talked about utilities have operated narrowband networks. So there's a skill set there with especially TDM based networks. LTE is, a different animal. It's IP based. And now, especially, your core networks, really, most of it's virtualized. You're getting into things like Kubernetes and containers. And so, it's a different skill set. And that's one reason, Southern Linc, we're kind of offering to do core as a service for other utilities, because we've got that kind of we've got the bumps and bruises, and we've kind of lived it, done it, and scaling that up for utility may be a challenge. I don't know. But I mean, we've got 25, 30 folks that they focus really on our core network between engineering and operations. And so, being able to offer that, we're, between Anterix offering 900 and hopefully us offering core as a service, we're trying to have that easy button for other utilities to go down the path, because then they can really focus on their radio access network, build that out, and be in the private LTE world with us, because it really is. I mean, Ryan touched on it too. It's about the ecosystem and developing the ecosystem. I mean, with devices like line fault current indicators, volt var optimization devices, getting LTE embedded in those devices where you're hanging those on distribution, and and that's really where we're going, and more folks in the camp to drive that ecosystem, all the better. It's a positive for the industry as a whole.
Still probably easier than building a new nuke, right?
Probably so. Yeah, I would think so.
Probably so.
I haven't built a new nuke. But,
and I wasn't even going to bring that up, but you alluded to these substantial projects that were marching forward in lockstep, and that had to be an interesting budgeting exercise. Okay, so just to finish out the conversation here, I like to end all of these interviews with a bit of like the hot take corner of even beyond private LTE, which obviously is the focus of this conversation. What do you foresee being that next big thing? What is going to start out in Alan's garage and go to mainstream adoption within the utility space quicker than others foresee?
Ryan,
I didn't prep you on that one, so I wanted to smack you in the face with it.
I'll go. You can speak a little bit about that one. I alluded to where my crystal ball looks. I think we're at the beginning stage in the utility side, critical infrastructure in general, frankly, of a true database kind of renaissance, I'll call it. I think there's so much opportunity, and I think we as an industry, I think, are somewhat laggards in some of that. When I look at other sectors, banking, healthcare, and stuff like that, I think they've done more with kind of data integration, taking advantage of cloud and consolidation and stuff like that. I think for good reason. We've been a little bit more prudent as a utility industry about how we've got there. But there's so much information. As Alan said, this connects back to the explosive growth of the sensors, right? Those aren't just 3 times more devices Alan and team are putting out there. That's 3 times some exponent worth of new data, that's being, brought into now a high velocity, kind of pipe, it's being put somewhere and probably not taken full utilization of, right? It's being used for some specific purpose. But when I combine that, with, and obviously there's a lot of security stuff still to figure out, but the conversations going on and, generative AI and this kind of stuff. And I think about the necessity of just the complexity, kind of how and who's going to operate this new grid once we all build it. It can't be done the way it's done today. I just can't conceive how it is, right? That some person is there monitoring the big boards like we see in the operation centers. I can't visualize that. Maybe Alan, you can about how that works. But, when you got all this dynamic stuff going on, in real time, power is reversing flow. And as you said, John, you got 10 megs popping up, at, a block level or something like that. I don't think you can do that with people alone. I think people will be the intelligence and the brain, but I really, truly believe what we're talking about here and what Alan and the nation are building are the foundations that's going to make all that stuff possible. And, I think these telecom teams and the people that are responsible for building this stuff are going to be the heroes about how that ultimately comes to market in reality and saves the day, if I can say, in terms of, making all this future possible, hit our clean energy targets, all of the new commitments. You guys have been tracking COP28 and some of the stuff coming out of it. We got a long road ahead of us, in terms of, kind of trying to do our part, to reduce the impacts of fossil fuels and bring clean energy and stuff in. There's a lot of work to do, but I think we're well set up for that part, John.
I think, Ryan touched on a key point. It's turning all these devices into data, and we do that now. Everything we use as an endpoint device that's fixed out there on the grid, we actually monitor that and use it as a LTE network monitoring device too. And so, we can look at the signal level on the device, any given moment, and we can trend that out. And so, if something's going on with that device, then we can figure out, well, let's look at other devices. And so is it a cell site issue? Is it a device issue? And so we're into this data age. I mean, I think we all know that. And so then you're getting into AI and machine learning. I mean, to Ryan's point, you're not going to have operators, sitting there monitoring, pushing buttons on a keyboard as much anymore. And that's what's going on the electric side. There's a lot more segmentation because, rightfully so, customers expect their power to stay up all the time. And so the more we're segmenting and, you're needing reclosers and other devices to do kind of high density coordination, there's data requirements on all that. And then, you add in, distributed energy resources. Now you got direct transfer trip. And so all those need some sort of connectivity. And so then, what can you do from an AI machine learning standpoint to optimize all that? So I think that's probably the big frontier that we're going to see ultimately, because I think it's obviously exceed the capacity of a human brain pretty quickly. So.